The candle on Sarah's desk had burned down to its last inch when she heard the sound that did not belong to the night. It was not the wind, though the storm outside had been throwing itself against the stone walls of Thornvale Palace for hours. It was not the settling groan of old architecture, which she had memorized in the 3 years she had spent sleeping beneath the weight of the archive's vaulted ceiling. It was something else. A footstep. Deliberate. Careful in the way that only someone who knew exactly where not to step could be careful, navigating the uneven flagstones of the lower corridor without making the third one from the eastern pillar cry out the way it always did for everyone else. Sarah set down her quill. She did not move. She simply listened, the way she had learned to listen in a palace where the invisible learned to survive by paying attention to everything the visible ignored. The archive's lower entrance was not on any official map of Thornvale Palace. Sarah knew this because she had catalogued every map in the collection, including the ones the palace architects had filed away in the restricted chest that technically required the royal seal to open, and which she had opened 17 times in 3 years, using a strip of thin copper she kept folded inside her left boot. The lower entrance connected to the catacomb passage, which connected to the old drainage channel, which connected, after a great deal of cold stone and darkness, to the forest. Beyond the eastern wall. Nobody used it. Nobody was supposed to know it existed. Sarah knew it existed because she had read about it in a builder's log from 230 years ago. And she knew nobody used it because she had checked the passage herself on a quiet afternoon and found nothing but old silence and undisturbed dust. The dust, she realized now, would no longer be undisturbed. She stood slowly, the way she did everything, without unnecessary motion, and moved to the edge of the bookshelf that divided the main archive from the narrow antechamber near the lower door. She did not step around it. She simply pressed herself against its side and waited, her breathing even, her heartbeat something she was consciously holding to a measured pace, the way her mother had taught her in a different life, in a different kind of silence. The door opened. The man who stepped through it was large in the way that old things are large, not with the aggressive, performance-forward size of young alphas who had grown into their power recently and wanted everyone to notice, but with something settled and structural, as if his body had long since made peace with the space it occupied and simply existed within it, without apology or announcement. He was soaked through. His dark clothing clung to shoulders that carried the particular tension of someone who had been cold for a very long time and had stopped expecting warmth. He had a scar that ran from below his left ear to the edge of his jaw, pale and old, the kind that had been made by something deliberate rather than something accidental. And he had, Sarah noticed with a precision that surprised even herself, the same eyes as the portrait on the eastern wall of the Hall of Predecessors, the one that every member of the current court walked past without looking at, because looking at it had become, in the 8 months since Caius took the throne, subtly inadvisable. "You are supposed to be dead," Sarah said. "If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one." The man turned toward her with the unhurried certainty of someone who had not been startled, because he had known she was there. His eyes found her in the dim space between the shelves, with a directness that made the small hairs along her arms rise in a way she had no immediate name for. He did not reach for a weapon, which she noted. He did not demand to know who she was, or what she was doing there, which she also noted, because most people, upon being discovered somewhere they should not be, asked those questions reflexively. He did not. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, taking inventory the way she herself took inventory, which was the way of someone who had learned to read situations before committing to them. And then he said, in a voice that was low and rough with disuse, but carried beneath that roughness something that made the air in the archive feel different, something that made the 2 elderly hounds sleeping in the corner lift their heads for the first time in hours, and then lay them back down, with a slowness that suggested not dismissal, but recognition. You are the one who reads the old records. It was not a question. Sarah straightened slightly. I am the archive keeper, she said, which is a different thing from being the one who reads the old records, though in practice the distinction rarely matters because I am the only one. Who comes down here? She paused. You did not answer what I said. You said I am supposed to be dead, he said. That is accurate. I am supposed to be. It was a careful arrangement. He moved further into the room with the same deliberate economy of motion, water dripping from his clothing onto stone that had absorbed centuries of other people's secrets without complaint. He looked at the shelves with an expression Sarah could not immediately categorize, something between recognition and grief. The expression of someone returning to a place they had not been certain they would ever see again. You recognized me, he said. It was not an accusation. If anything, it carried something close to curiosity. The portrait in the Hall of Predecessors is an accurate likeness, Sarah said, allowing for 20 years and whatever you have been doing in them. She studied him. King Aldrich. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. He looked at her then with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the way someone looks when a thing they had prepared themselves to explain turns out to require no explanation at all. You are not going to run, he said. Where would I run to? Sarah said. It was not precisely a question. She moved to the small brazier in the corner and added 2 more pieces of wood to the coals, because whatever else was true about the situation, the man in front of her was dangerously cold, and cold men made poor decisions, and she had a feeling that the quality of his decisions in the next several hours was going to matter a great deal. Sit down, she said. I will get you something dry from the maintenance chest. The archive keeps spare robes for when the condensation damages clothing, which happens often enough that we plan for it. She did not wait to see if he would comply. She moved to the chest, opened it, and produced a heavy wool robe that was plain and colorless but dry. When she turned back, he had sat, without evident objection, on the old chair near the brazier that she privately thought of as hers, because she was the only one who ever sat in it. He took the robe when she offered it without comment, which she appreciated. There was a particular kind of pride that refused comfort on principle, and it was the kind that made things harder for everyone. He did not have that kind. He pulled the robe around his shoulders and leaned forward, extending his hands toward the heat, and for a moment, he looked simply like a man who was very tired, which Sarah suspected was also accurate. How long have you been in Thornvale's archive? He asked. 3 years, she said. She settled on the low stool across from him, the one she used when she was working on the floor-level shelves, and looked at him directly. She had found, over time, that direct looking made people uncertain about her status. Omegas were supposed to look at the middle distance, at the floor, at some neutral point that communicated awareness without challenge. Sarah had never been able to fully commit to this convention. Since 2 months before the news came from the northern border about your death. She said the last word, with the slight inflection that indicated she was putting it in conceptual quotation marks. The news was very complete. It had details. Details that seemed designed to foreclose further inquiry. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. Confirmation, rather, of something he had long since accepted. They were thorough, he said. Thorough enough that your son has been king for 8 months and the court has largely settled into the new arrangement, Sarah said. Largely. She watched him. You came back for a reason. I came back because the compact is breaking, he said. And the flatness with which he said it told her that this was not a thing he had decided impulsively, that this was something he had been watching from a distance, measuring, waiting on with the patience of a man who had learned to wait as a survival strategy. He looked up at her. You keep the old records. Do you know what the compact is? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm pressed its hands against the palace walls, and the candle guttered slightly in the draft from the lower passage. "The Thornvale Founding Compact," she said carefully, "signed in the 3rd century by the 5 founding bloodlines. It binds the ruling line to the land, specifically to the Pack territory's oldest boundaries, through a blood covenant renewed at the solstice rite every 20 years by the reigning monarch." She paused. "The next renewal is in 6 weeks, and Caius cannot complete it," Aldrich said. Sarah knew this. She had known it for 4 months, since she had cross-referenced the lineage records against the compact's requirements, and found the gap that nobody who had not read both documents in full would have any reason to notice. The compact required the renewal to be performed by a monarch of direct founding bloodline descent through both parental lines. Caius's mother, the late queen, had been of the Valen line. His father, Aldrich, was of the Thornvale line. But Aldrich was not dead, and if Aldrich was not dead, then the succession that had placed Caius on the throne had not followed the compact's own provisions for transfer of power, which required either the monarch's confirmed death or a formal abdication witnessed by the Pack elders, of whom 3 still living had not been present for any such ceremony. The compact did not merely authorize the monarchy. The compact was the monarchy. Without its renewal, the territory's oldest protections would begin to dissolve. The borders that held, the old agreements with the neighboring packs, the covenant with the land itself that kept Thornvale's wolves strong across generations. "You need to be the one to renew it," Sarah said. "I need access to the original document," he said, "and I need to understand what has been changed in the court's record since my removal. I need to know the shape of what has been built in my absence before I can understand how to move within it without tearing everything apart." He looked at her steadily. "I do not want a war. A war kills the Pack either way." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the young king she had glimpsed in corridors, handsome and uncertain in the way of someone who had been given something too large for their current size and was still growing into it. Not evil, she thought, not intentionally, but surrounded by people who found his malleability useful. She thought about Isidora Vielle, the king's chief counselor, who moved through the court with the measured grace of someone who had planned for every contingency and enjoyed the planning as much as the outcome. She thought about the borders. She thought about the Pack families in the outer territories whose children she had seen in the census records, growing up in the protection of covenants they did not know were fraying. She thought about all of this in the space of approximately 4 seconds, which was longer than she usually needed to make decisions, but shorter than most people would have required. And then she said, "Tell me what you need to know. I will tell you what the records say." That was how it began. Over the following days, a pattern established itself with the quiet efficiency of 2 people who had each spent a great deal of time working alone, and had, therefore, developed independently the skill of working without wasted motion. Aldrich came to the archive each night through the catacomb passage. Sarah had cleared the dust from the passage entrance in a way that made it look undisturbed, which was a distinction that mattered. She left the lower door's latch set to a position that would not catch. She prepared the brazier before his arrival, and extinguished it before the palace's early servants began their rounds. And in the hours between, they worked. He told her what he remembered of the court as it had been. She told him what the records said it had become. Together they built, with the slow precision of archivists and the careful strategic instinct of someone who had survived 20 years of forced exile in the Northern Territories, a picture of Thornvale Palace as it currently was and as it needed to be navigated. Isidora Vielle, Sarah told him on the 3rd night, had been appointed chief counselor within 6 weeks of the Dow. Announcement of his death. A speed that in retrospect communicated pre-planning. She was of the Vale family, minor nobility with significant commercial interests in the southern trade routes, which the current court's policies had, over 8 months, consistently favored in ways that the old court's policies had not. She was intelligent, Sarah said, in a way that did not show off. which was the most useful kind of intelligent to be in a political environment. She had made Caius dependent on her. Counsel through the specific technique of making herself indispensable during moments of crisis, and then, quietly, ensuring that crises arose at regular intervals. She had a gift for seeing what people needed to believe and providing them with precisely that. She was always capable, Aldrich said, and the way he said it was not admiring exactly, but it carried a kind of recognition that spoke to a long familiarity. I should have seen it more clearly. You were managing a kingdom, Sarah said. She was managing you. Those are different scales of attention. She looked up from the document she had been reading. The archive was quiet around them, the kind of deep silence that accumulates in places where old things are kept, a silence with weight and texture. In the warm light of the brazier, she was aware of him in a way she kept setting aside with the practical efficiency of someone who could not afford to be distracted. He was sitting across the table from her, studying the lineage, maps she had drawn out from the census records, and there was something about the quality of his attention that she had not encountered before. A way of focusing on a problem that was total, without being tense, still without being disengaged. It reminded her of something she had read about once in an old natural philosophy text. The way certain predators could hold absolute stillness, that was not the stillness of absence but the stillness of complete presence. She returned to her document. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. She had not told anyone about him. This was, on its surface, the obvious choice, since telling anyone would immediately end whatever chance existed for the situation to resolve without catastrophe. But it was not only strategy. She had lived for 3 years in this palace as a person no one looked at directly, a category of invisible that was not unkind exactly, but was thoroughly complete, and there was something she had not expected about being seen. Not seen in the way of being noticed, which happened sometimes when she stepped into a space where she was not expected, and someone registered her presence with mild surprise before looking away. Being seen in the way of being looked at by someone who was actually curious about what they found. Aldrich asked her questions. Not about her usefulness, not about what she knew, though he asked about those things too, but about how she had come to be here, what she had been before, what she thought about things that had nothing to do with the crisis at hand. He asked the way someone asks when they are genuinely interested in the answer. And Sarah, who had not been the subject of that kind of interest in longer than she wanted to calculate, found it unexpectedly difficult to manage. The difficulty was not in the questions themselves, which were reasonable questions that she had clear answers to. The difficulty was in the act of answering them in front of someone who listened in the specific way he listened, with the full and unpartitioned attention of a person for whom listening was not a pause between speaking, but a primary activity, the way certain readers treat reading, as the thing itself, and not the preparation for something else. She had not been listened to that way before. She had been heard, which was different. She had been consulted, which was different still. She had been useful, which was the category her life had mostly organized itself around. But listened to, in that complete and genuine way, was a category she had not had much experience of, and she was finding, somewhat inconveniently, that her response to it was not as neutral as she would have preferred. She had grown up in the Ashvale family's outer estate, she told him, one night when the archive was particularly still, and the question had come naturally enough that refusing it would have been its own kind of statement. Her family were minor pack members, not ranked, not particularly gifted, comfortable in the middle distance of pack society in the way of people who had never been tested. She had been different from early childhood in ways that were difficult to define, sharper than expected, interested in things that no one around her had a category for, drawn to old texts and older questions, in a way that made her simultaneously valuable to anyone who needed something found, and slightly uncomfortable to anyone who preferred that certain things remain unfound. When the palace had advertised for an archive assistant 3 years ago, she had applied with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared for a single door for a long time, She had been hired, she suspected, because no one else had applied, and because her referral letter from the estate's old librarian had described her, in terms meant as faint praise, as uniquely relentless. Relentless, Aldrich said, and the word in his mouth had a different quality than it had had in her. Telling of it. It was not intended as a compliment, Sarah said. No, he said. But it is one. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire rather than at her, and she was grateful for that, because her face was doing something she was not certain she could effectively conceal. A warmth that had nothing to do with the brazier, and everything to do with the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being accurately described by someone who meant it well. She turned back to her work, and said nothing. Further, and after a moment he turned back to his work as well, and the archive held them both in its old and patient silence. On the 7th night, the situation changed. Sarah had arrived at the archive after the evening meal to find that someone had been through the restricted chest. Not carelessly, whoever it had been was methodical. The kind of methodical that left everything in approximately the right place, but not in the exact right place. Not the exact millimeter-precise arrangement that Sarah maintained, not because she was particularly orderly by temperament, but because precise arrangement meant she could detect a disturbance with the same reliability that a wolf detected a scent. She stood in front of the chest for a long moment, cataloging what was slightly wrong, and then she went to see what was missing. The compact itself was still there, in its original protective casing. The lineage records were there. What was gone was a specific census addendum, a supplementary document from 40 years ago that cross-referenced bloodline inheritance for compact renewal eligibility with a notation, tucked into its 3rd page, about a secondary qualifying lineage that the founding families had embedded as a failsafe in the event of interruption to the primary line. Someone knew what to look for. That meant someone knew the question existed, and that meant Sarah understood with a clarity that settled cold and sharp into her chest that she and Aldrich were not the only ones who had been reading the old records. She did not wait for him to arrive through the catacomb passage. She went to the passage herself and followed it to the forest, and she found him making his way through the dark, along the old path, with the ease of someone who had known these woods long before he had needed to use them for survival. He stopped when he saw her. She was aware that she was breathing harder than usual, not from the walk, but from the particular physical response of urgency. That her body staged without her full consent in moments when things became genuinely dangerous. Someone has been in the restricted chest, she said. They took the bloodline addendum, the one with the secondary qualifying lineage. She watched him process this. The way he processed things was something she had learned to read over 7 nights. The brief, absolute stillness, the slight shift of focus from the immediate to the implications, the return to the present with whatever new calculation he had made already integrated into his working understanding of the situation. It happened quickly. They know about the failsafe, she said. Isidora, he said. Not a question. Or someone working for her, Sarah said. The point is that she now knows the primary line's eligibility is compromised. She knows Caius cannot complete the renewal, and she knows there is a secondary option. She paused. Which means she is going to move before we do. They walked back through the passage together, and the proximity in the narrow stone corridor was something Sarah noted and set aside with slightly less efficiency than she would have liked. In the archive, she went directly to the shelf where she kept her personal working copies, the ones she made in her own hand of documents too fragile to reference frequently, and pulled out the copy she had made of the bloodline addendum before she had returned the original to the chest 3 weeks ago, because she copied everything fragile on principle, which was one of those habits that had seemed excessive until suddenly it was not. She spread it on the table. The secondary qualifying lineage, she said, pointing to the 3rd page notation. The founding compact's drafters built in a provision. If the primary ruling bloodline could not complete the solstice renewal, the ceremony could be performed instead by a monarch of the primary line in union with a mate of the secondary qualifying bloodline, the Ashvale line. She stopped. She heard the quality of the silence change. She looked up. Aldrich was looking at her with an expression she could not categorize because she had not seen it before. Something that was several things at once, recognition, and something older than recognition. Something that moved through him visibly in the way that only things with deep roots move when they are finally brought to light. "The Ashvale line," he said. "My family," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it that way. "My mother's line. The original Ashvale estate has records going back to the founding period. I knew this abstractly. I knew we were an old family. But I never had a reason to connect it to the compact, because the primary line has always been intact before." She looked at the document. "I appear to be the secondary provision." "You are," Aldrich said, and the way he said it was not simple confirmation. It was something else, the tone of someone who has been holding a piece of a map for a very long time and has just been handed the piece that shows where they are. She made herself look at him directly. "This changes the shape of what we are doing," she said. "Because if Isidora has the addendum, she knows the failsafe exists, and she will be looking for the Ashvale line's current representative. She will find my name in the census records. It is a matter of time." She paused. "And the renewal ceremony requires a union, which is not a small thing to say." "No," he said. "It is not." He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention, which was something she had already catalogued as formidable and which she was finding, at close range, in this context, significantly more difficult to be the subject of without obvious effect. "I will not ask that of you as a strategy," he said carefully. "It requires your understanding of what it means in full and your genuine consent. It is a mate bond. The compact does not recognize performance. It recognizes the actual thing." Sarah was quiet, for long enough that the candle on the table burned noticeably lower. She was thinking about the pack families in the outer territories. She was thinking about the fraying covenants. She was thinking about the 6 weeks remaining before the solstice. She was also, with the honesty that she applied to everything she examined, thinking about 7 nights of quiet work and questions that meant something, and the particular sensation of being seen clearly and not found wanting. She was thinking about an old portrait on a wall that she had looked at many times and the reality of the man it depicted, which was a larger and more present thing than any portrait could contain. "Tell me what you actually think of it," she said. "Not the strategic case, not the necessity. What you think when you set those aside." He held her gaze for a moment that had a different quality than any of the moments that had come before it. "I think," he said slowly, "that 7 nights is both a very short time and a surprisingly complete one, depending on what fills them. I think that I have not wanted anything for 20 years, in a way that was not tactical, and that wanting something that is not tactical is an experience I had forgotten the texture of." He stopped. He said, "I think you are the most genuinely alive person I have encountered in longer than I can tell you, and that has nothing to do with bloodlines." Sarah breathed in and then out, measured. "That is a complicated answer to what I asked," she said. "Yes," he said. "But I think you prefer complicated answers that are true to simple answers that are not." She looked at the document on the table. She looked at him. "We have 6 weeks," she said, "and Isidora is already moving." She straightened. "We should start with the council elders. 3 of them did not witness an abdication because there was none. They will know the difference between a legal succession and a performed one, if someone asks the right questions." He studied her. "That is an agreement," he said. "It is a beginning," she said. "The rest will depend on what happens when it is not just the 2 of us in an archive." She picked up her quill and pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward her. "Sit down. We have work to do before morning. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on." What Sarah had understood theoretically about Isidora Vielle and what she now began to understand in practice were different kinds of knowing. The theoretical version was that Isidora was intelligent, strategic, and had spent 8 months building a position that was durable. The practical version was that Isidora was all of those things, with a precision that was almost elegant, the way a trap is elegant when it has been built by someone who genuinely loves the craft of building traps. The morning after Sarah's discovery of the missing document, Isidora appeared in the archive for the first time in 3 years. She appeared the way she did everything, without announcement, without explanation, as if her presence was simply a natural feature of whatever space she occupied. She was dressed in silver gray, her dark hair arranged with the geometric exactness that Sarah had observed from a distance and now saw up close, and she looked around the archive with the serene attention of someone taking inventory of a space they were considering acquiring. "Archive Keeper Ashvale," she said. Her voice was warm. It was always warm. Sarah had observed this from a distance, and understood now, up close, that the warmth was a quality Isidora wore the way other people wore jewelry, deliberately chosen and consistently maintained. "I have been meaning to visit your domain for some time. The king has asked me to review the historical record on several matters of succession law. I understand you are the one to speak to." "I am the one to speak to about what the archive contains," Sarah said. She had had approximately 8 seconds of warning when she heard footsteps on the main stair that were not any footsteps she had memorized, and she had used those 8 seconds to ensure that her working copies were on a different shelf, covered by a cataloging text, and that there was nothing on the table that was not entirely ordinary. She had also used 3 of those seconds to catalog her own face and confirm that it was presenting what she intended it to present, which was the composed, mildly curious attention of someone who spent their life with old documents and found most human interactions moderately less interesting than those documents. "What specific matters of succession law is the king interested in?" Isidora smiled. It was a beautiful smile in the way of things that have been developed through extensive practice. "The compact renewal requirements," she said pleasantly. "Specifically, the eligibility conditions for the presiding authority." She looked at Sarah with those precise dark eyes. "You would know if there were any unusual provisions, given how thoroughly you know the collection." "The collection is extensive," Sarah said. "A thorough answer would require some time to compile." She allowed a small pause. "I could prepare a summary document for the king's review within the week." "That would be very helpful," Isidora said. She continued to look at Sarah with the calm attention of someone who was reading something that was not quite visible, the way an experienced tracker looks at ground that appears undisturbed but is not. "You are an unusual person, Keeper Ashvale. I have always thought so. You are quiet in a way that does not mean absence." She tilted her head very slightly. "It must be lonely, working down here alone." "I find the archive sufficient company," Sarah said. Isidora held her gaze for 1 moment longer than the social script required, and in that moment, Sarah felt the specific quality of being assessed by someone who was very good at assessment and was not finding the result entirely expected. Then Isidora smiled again and said she would look forward to the summary document, and she left with the same unhurried certainty with which she had arrived. Sarah stood without moving until the footsteps had entirely faded. Then she breathed. She had 4 days, possibly 3. The council elders were not a simple approach. There were 5 who remained from Aldrich's reign, of whom 3 had the standing to formally question the succession's legality under the compact's own provisions, and of those 3, 1 was elderly and in poor health and unlikely to be available for confrontation. 1 had retired to his family's outer estate and was 3 days' journey away, and 1, a woman named Elder Cassian, was still in residence at the palace and was known for a quality of moral stubbornness that had made her simultaneously invaluable and inconvenient to 3 successive administrations. Aldrich had, it turned out, a particular respect for Elder Cassian. She had, it turned out, told him the truth on several occasions when truth had been scarce. He thought she would tell it again, if she were given the full picture to respond to. The difficulty was reaching her without alerting the court's current information infrastructure, which Isidora had organized with the thoroughness of someone who understood that information was more valuable than gold, and therefore managed it accordingly. Sarah had spent 3 years being invisible, and invisibility, she explained to Aldrich on the 8th night, was an infrastructure of its own. She knew which servants spoke to which counselors. She knew who was watched and who was not. She knew which routes through the palace were monitored by loyalty, and which by mere convenience. She could reach Elder Cassian through 3 intermediate steps that would leave no trail that anyone currently paying attention would know to look for, because the people involved were so thoroughly beneath the court's notice that monitoring them would have seemed like a waste of attention. She was right about this. She reached Elder Cassian on the evening of the 2nd day through a kitchen worker who was owed a favor by a laundress who was trusted by the elder's personal attendant, and the message she sent was 7 words. "The king your oath holds is still living." Elder Cassian came to the archive the next morning. She was a small woman with the compact, settled energy of someone who had carried significant weight for a very long time and was no longer bothered by it. She was perhaps 70, with white hair cut practically short, and eyes that were the clear, unsentimental brown of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. She looked at Sarah when she arrived and said without preamble, "Where is he?" "He will be here tonight," Sarah said. "Good," Elder Cassian said. She sat in the chair by the brazier, the chair that Sarah thought of as hers, and that had become, over the past 8 nights, Aldrich's, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Sarah with the direct assessment of someone who did not have time for indirect approaches. "And you, Ashvale, who is your mother's family?" Sarah looked at her. "You know," she said. "I know the bloodline addendum," Elder Cassian said. "I was one of the compact witnesses 30 years ago. I have been watching for the Ashvale line since the succession announcement." She studied Sarah with the particular attention of someone completing a recognition. "I had assumed it would be someone louder," she said. There was something in her tone that was not criticism. "Loud does not tend to survive in archives," Sarah said. Elder Cassian made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No, I suppose it does not." She looked at Sarah with something that was beginning to resemble respect, which was not a thing Sarah had extensive recent experience of, and which she received now with the careful steadiness of someone accepting a gift they were not certain they had deserved. "You understand what the bond means," Elder Cassian said. "In practice, not just in the document." "I am learning," Sarah said, which was the most honest answer she had. "That will do," Elder Cassian said. "That will do better than certainty, as a matter of fact. The compact was built on the idea that bloodlines recognize each other for reasons that go beyond strategy, that the recognition is the substance of the thing, not the ceremony." She looked at Sarah steadily. "Does it recognize?" Sarah thought about 7 nights and particular questions, and the specific sensation of being present in someone's full attention. She thought about the cold fire behind her ribs that had been there since the first night, and that she had been efficiently managing, and that she was now looking at more directly, in the presence of someone who had asked a direct question and deserved a direct answer. "Yes," she said. Elder Cassian nodded once, the nod of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. "Tonight, then," she said. "Bring him." The night that followed was long and quiet, and consequential in the way of nights where the decisions are mostly already made, and what remains is simply the speaking of them aloud. Aldrich and Elder Cassian talked for 3 hours in the archive, while Sarah listened and occasionally supplied a specific document from the collection to support or clarify a point. The elder questioned him with the thoroughness of someone who had known him for decades and trusted, but was not willing to accept on trust what could be verified. He answered with the directness of a man who had spent 20 years with nothing to protect him, but accuracy. By the end of the 3 hours, Elder Cassian had satisfied herself on the main questions. By the end of another hour, she had outlined the legal path. It was narrow. It required the formal challenge to the succession to be made at the solstice rite itself, in front of the full pack assembly, which was the one setting in which the compact's own provisions could override a sitting king's authority. It required Aldrich to be present and identified. It required the bond to be acknowledged before the assembly, because the secondary provision's activation was not effective until acknowledged. And it required, Elder Cassian said with the calm clarity of someone stating an unpleasant arithmetic, that Caius be handled with enough care and precision that the pack's loyalty was not split in a way that left lasting damage. He is not the villain of this, Aldrich said. He was used. He will need to understand that, Elder Cassian said, and accept it. That is the harder thing. I know, Aldrich said. Sarah looked at him across the table in the quiet archive and thought about fathers and sons and the particular grief of things that cannot be undone, only navigated forward from. She thought about what it cost someone to hold that grief and still make the decision that the pack's survival required. She thought about the texture of his voice when he had said he did not want a war, the absolute sincerity of it, which was not the sincerity of strategy, but of someone who had seen what war cost from very close range and had chosen his way through every subsequent decision, partly with that cost in his working memory. The next 4 days were the most precisely demanding of Sarah's life, which had not been short of demanding. The preparation for the solstice rite required documentation, specifically a formal compact challenge filing that had not been used in recorded history, but that existed in the archive as a procedural template, which Sarah located in a sub-collection no one had accessed in at least 40 years and transcribed with the accuracy that she brought to everything, and with the particular care of someone who understood that a single incorrectly transcribed term could invalidate the entire proceeding. It required Aldrich to make contact with 4 pack families whose loyalty was to the compact rather than to any individual king, families who were old enough to remember the covenant's importance in the days when it had been actively honored, and who would stand as witnesses at the rite. It required Sarah to continue her daily work in the archive without alteration, appearing in the corridors and common spaces of the palace with the same measured, unremarkable presence she had maintained for 3 years, even as she was aware that Isidora's attention was now shaped somewhat differently by whatever she had or had not concluded from her visit to the archive. It required, additionally, a conversation between Sarah and Aldrich that neither of them had the time to approach slowly, and therefore approached directly. It happened on the 4th night, which was the last night before the arrangements were too settled to revisit. He had been looking at her for most of the evening with the quality of attention that he used when he was working up to saying something, which she had learned to recognize over the course of the past 11 nights, and she had been waiting for it with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was usually more efficient than prompting. Finally, he set down the document he was holding and looked at her directly and said, "After this is over." She waited. "If the rite succeeds," he said, "if the challenge holds and the compact is renewed, there is a shape to that outcome which we have not spoken about directly." He held her gaze with the honesty that had been, from the first night, one of the most disorienting things about him. The complete absence of the social management that most people of significant rank deployed automatically. He simply looked at her and said what was true. "The bond does not require that anything continue beyond the renewal. I want you to know that. The compact provision requires acknowledgement, not permanence. You would have discharged the obligation fully." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him and thinking about accuracy, which was the value she had organized her entire working life around, the precise and complete representation of what was actually there. The archive existed to hold truth. She had given her adult years to that purpose. It seemed an odd time to be less than accurate about the most immediate thing. "That is a very careful way of giving me an exit," she said. "Yes," he said. "I notice you did not use it to describe what you want." She said. He was quiet. Something moved through his expression that had been there in smaller forms over the past 11 nights, and that was now, in this moment, fully present. The recognition she had felt from him from the beginning, but that had been contained and respectful of her own space and her own pace, and which was now simply visible for what it was. "I want," he said slowly, "what the archive already holds, in a sense. The complete thing, not the provision, the actual thing that the provision exists to ratify." He paused. "I am aware that I am not a simple situation. You are a dethroned king who has been living in the northern wilderness for 20 years and is attempting to reclaim a throne without a war, while simultaneously navigating a mate bond that neither of us planned," Sarah said. "That is not simple, no." She looked at him. "But I did not come to the archive because I was looking for simple. I came because I was looking for something with enough depth to be worth the attention." She paused. "You have depth." He made a sound that was, unmistakably, a low and brief instance of what she thought might be a laugh, which she had not heard from him before, and which had the quality of something that had been absent for a long time and was finding its way back with some uncertainty about the welcome it would receive. "That may be the most particular compliment I have been paid," he said. "I mean it specifically," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the full quality of his attention and something else, something that was not the assessment he gave to problems or the focus he gave to documents, but the particular and complete quality of a gaze that was given to a person and not a situation. And Sarah held it without looking away, and felt the thing that had been present for 11 nights settle into her chest, with a finality that was not closing, but opening. The finality of a thing that has found its correct place and stopped moving. After, "This is over," he said again. And this time it was not a question about exits. It was something else. "After this is over," she said. The solstice rite was held at the standing stones beyond the palace's eastern garden, as it had been held for 230 years, at dawn, with the pack assembly arranged in the traditional concentric circles around the central altar stone. Caius was there in the formal regalia of the Thornvale throne, looking young in the morning light and slightly pale, in the way of someone who had been sleeping poorly for some time, and was aware that today was important without being entirely certain why. Isidora stood at his right shoulder in pale silver, her face composed in the way of someone who has prepared for multiple contingencies and is monitoring current conditions against her internal inventory of plans. Sarah arrived with Elder Cassian from the southern approach, which was one of the 7 traditional approaches, and therefore not remarkable in itself. Aldrich arrived through the standing stones themselves. The old paths through the forest knew him. The wolves who had been placed as perimeter guards 200 yards out were 4 from the families he had spoken to in the past days, and they moved aside with their heads low and their eyes clear, which was not the posture of wolves performing obedience, but of wolves performing recognition. He came through the stones into the assembly in the gray light of early morning, and he did not arrive quietly. He arrived the way a thing arrives that has been absent for a long time, and whose absence the land itself has registered, and the pack assembly, 300 wolves of Thornvale in their various forms and ranks, felt it in the particular way that bodies feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not with thought, first, but with sensation, a ripple that moved through the concentric circles from the outside in. Caius went very still. Isidora's face did something brief and complex and then returned to composure. Elder Cassian stepped forward before either of them could speak. She had a voice that had been trained on 3 decades of formal proceedings, and that carried with the precision of someone who knew the acoustics of the standing stones personally. Under the provisions of the Thornvale Founding Compact, Article 7, Succession and Continuity, I call upon the Assembly to witness a formal compact challenge. I invoke this on the grounds of living authority. She paused. To allow the legal phrase to register. It registered. The assembly was very quiet. King Aldrich of the primary Thornvale line stands before you. He is alive. He did not abdicate. The required witnesses did not witness an abdication because there was none to witness. She looked at the assembly steadily. The succession of Caius was enacted in good faith by a court that was provided with false information. This challenge does not indict the young king's character. It addresses the legal standing of the renewal this assembly has gathered to perform. Caius had not looked away from Aldrich. His face was doing something that was painful to watch. The specific expression of someone whose understanding of their own history is shifting beneath them in real time. A young man discovering that the floor of a room he has lived in for 8 months is built on something that was misrepresented to him. He was, Sarah thought with a clarity that surprised her in its fullness, not the enemy. He had never been the enemy. He had been the method. She had seen him in the corridors twice in 3 years. Once when he was still a prince, and his father's presumed death had been fresh enough that the grief was visible in the particular way. Grief is visible in young people who have not yet learned to contain it, sitting in the chest rather than the face, making the shoulders heavier than they should be, making the movement slightly slower than the person intends. And once 3 months into his kingship, when he was walking with Isidora, and the grief had been replaced by something more opaque and more practiced, the careful composure of someone who had accepted help managing their expression from someone whose motives they had not yet thought to question. He had looked, both times, like a person who was in the right place by the wrong method, which was a specific kind of loneliness that Sarah recognized because she had stood adjacent to it for 3 years. The loneliness of someone who was filling a role that was defined before they arrived by people who needed a particular shape of person and had done what was necessary to produce it. She had felt, both times, something that was not quite sympathy, but was in the same neighborhood as sympathy, and had returned to her archive and her documents, and had not permitted herself to examine why. "Father," he said. The word came out without the diplomatic armor that everything else he said in public came wrapped in. It came out the way words come. Out when the person saying them has temporarily lost access to the layer of self-management that public figures learn to maintain. It came out plain and young and real. Aldrich looked at his son for a long moment. 20 years was in that look. 20 years of distance that had not been chosen but had been lived anyway. And also something else. The recognition of a man looking at someone who had grown up in his absence and had done so, on the evidence, without becoming a bad person despite having been placed in circumstances designed to make bad choices easy. "I know," Aldrich said. He said it the way you say a thing to someone when you are acknowledging that you know what they are feeling without requiring them to say it further. "I know." Isidora moved. She was too intelligent to make a public scene. What she did instead was address the assembly in the warm, precise voice that had served her well for 8 months, offering a reframing of the situation that was technically accurate in its individual components and thoroughly misleading in its arrangement of them, the way the most effective misdirection always is. She spoke of stability and continuity, and the pack's welfare, and the disruptive potential of succession challenges, and the importance of the existing structures that had been built with care over the past 8 months. She was very good. Sarah, listening, acknowledged inwardly that she was very good. Then Elder Cassian said, "Keeper Ashvale," and Sarah stepped forward. She had never stood in front of an assembled pack before. 300 wolves were a different thing from 300 people. Not because they were less intelligent, but because the pack's collective attention had a quality that individual attention did not. A layered, resonant awareness that came from shared bond and shared territory, and could be felt by anyone of bloodline sensitivity as a kind of pressure, steady and immense. Sarah felt it. She stood within it and did not step back. She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible in this palace, and she had been very good at it, and she had understood the value of it, and it had served her well. But there were things that could only be done in full visibility, and this was one of them. She said the lineage. She said it correctly, with the formal Old Tongue pronunciation that she had practiced from the founding documents, the Ashvale line going back to the 3rd century, the bloodline that had been built into the compact as its fail-safe by founders who had understood that primary things fail and had been wise enough to plan for that. She presented Elder Cassian's documentation. She named the provision. She did not look at Isidora. She looked at the assembly, and then she looked at Aldrich, and the thing that happened when she looked at him in front of 300 witnesses in the gray morning light of the solstice was not a performance. It was not strategic. It was simply what had been building for 11 nights. Becoming visible in the one moment when visibility was required of it, the thing the compact's founders had understood when they built recognition into the ceremony rather than procedure. The fact that what was real could not be performed and did not need to be. The wolves of Thornvale Pack felt it. The bond was not invisible to those who shared a pack sensitivity. It moved through the assembly the way the earlier recognition had moved, from the outside in. A ripple that was not surprise, but confirmation, the specific resonance of a thing that fits into the shape that was always meant to hold it. Caius looked at Sarah. He looked at his father. He was quiet for a very long time, standing in the morning light in the formal regalia that he had worn for 8 months, and that had never, Sarah thought, looked entirely like it belonged to him, not because he was not worthy, but because the belonging of formal things was not only about worthiness, but about lineage and covenant and the specific way that certain inheritances recognized their proper heirs. He looked young. He looked tired. He looked like someone making a decision that was costing him something real and doing it anyway, which was, Sarah knew, the definition of integrity in its most basic form. Then he reached up and removed the ceremonial seal from around his neck, the physical token of the Thornvale authority that was worn at formal rites, and he held it out toward Aldrich. "I did not know," he said. His voice was steady. He was better than the circumstances had required him to be, which Sarah filed away as important information about who Caius actually was, when external pressure removed the management his advisor had layered over him. "I would not have. I want that said in front of all of them." "It is said," Elder Cassian said formally. "It is witnessed." Aldrich took the seal from his son's hand. He held it for a moment, and then he looked at Caius with something that was not the simple reconciliation of a story's resolution, but the beginning of the longer and more complicated work of two people who had been separated by a lie and were now occupying the same space for the first time with the actual knowledge of each other. "We will talk," he said. "Not here, not with the assembly, but we will talk." "Yes," Caius said. Isidora left before the renewal ceremony began. She left with the composure of someone who had already accepted a loss and pivoted to calculating the next position, which Sarah found, unexpectedly, less contemptible than she had anticipated. There was something about watching Isidora recalibrate in real time that was, if not admirable, at least recognizable as the behavior of someone who had organized their entire identity around strategic survival and was now deploying that instinct in the direction of their own continuity. She stopped beside Sarah on her way through the standing stones and said, quietly enough that only Sarah could hear, "You were thorough." She sounded almost approving. Then she was gone. The renewal ceremony itself was old and spare, and required very little that was complicated. It required the monarch of the primary line and the mate of the secondary qualifying line to stand together at the altar stone in the moment when the solstice sun cleared the eastern tree line and completed the blood covenant in the ancient form. Aldrich stood at the altar stone. Sarah stood with him. The sun came up over the eastern forest in the particular gold of early solstice morning, the specific quality of light that was different from every other morning's light in ways that were difficult to articulate, but that every pack member present felt with the clarity of instinct. a warmth that was older than any ceremony, and that the ceremony had been built to hold. Elder Cassian spoke the words. They were short words. The oldest language held things in economy rather than elaboration. The compact did not ask for promises. It asked for presence. The recognition was the thing. The rest was the living of it. Aldrich looked at Sarah in the solstice light, and she looked back at him. And what passed between them in that moment was not performed, and was not a strategy, and was not a provision. It was simply what it was. 11 nights and an archive, and two people who had seen each other clearly in a low light and chosen the same direction anyway. And the compact that the founding bloodlines had built 230 years ago recognized it. With the certainty of something that knows its own truth. The land knew him. The pack felt the covenant close. The old borders held. The warmth that moved through the standing stones was not metaphorical. It was the specific warmth of something that has been broken and is now whole. The specific warmth of a thing settling into the shape it was always meant to occupy. Afterwards, when the assembly had dispersed, and the formal proceedings had resolved into the quieter business of practical reinstatement and the documentation that Sarah was already mentally organizing, they stood together at the edge of the standing stones in the morning light. She was looking at the forest. He was looking at her. She was aware of this without needing to turn toward it. "The archive," she said. "I should go back. There is a significant amount of documentation that needs to be corrected, and there are several records that need formal annotation regarding the succession period." She paused. "It is going to take months." "I know," he said. There was something in his voice that she had not heard before. A lightness that was very new. The sound of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for a very long time, and has set it down, and is still adjusting to the absence of it. "I expect I will need to consult the archive frequently, for the reinstatement documentation." Sarah looked at the forest. "The archive," she said carefully, "is open to the king." She paused. "Particularly in the evenings. The lower passage remains accessible." He made the sound that was a laugh, fuller than the first one she had heard, and it was a good sound, the sound of something returning to itself. She turned toward it without deciding to, and found him looking at her in the morning light with the complete quality of that gaze and something else that was simply warmth, uncomplicated and unhurried, the warmth of someone who has arrived somewhere and intends to remain. "Sarah," he said, "we have work." "To do," she said. "We do," he said. He did not move immediately. He simply stayed where he was, looking at her, in the solstice morning, with the time of a man who has learned patience in the hardest school there is and who is, for the first time in 20 years, spending that patience on something he wants, rather than something he is enduring. "We do." She looked at him. She allowed herself, fully and without management, to feel the warmth that had been present for 11 nights, and that was now, in the full light of morning, in front of the standing stones of a covenant renewed, simply true. It was not simple in any other sense. It was not without complication or history, or the long work of two people building something real from an unlikely beginning. But it was true. The compact's founders had understood, when they built recognition into the ceremony, that the real thing could not be performed. They had been right. She turned toward the palace. She had documentation to prepare. He fell into step beside her. They walked together through the standing stones in the solstice morning, through the gold light of a land that had recognized its king, and a covenant that had recognized its heirs, back toward the work that waited, back toward the archive and the corridors, and the long and particular business of a life being rebuilt from scratch, into something better than what the lie had interrupted. It was, Sarah thought, the best kind of work. The kind that mattered. The kind that was worth being relentless about. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments. Did you see this ending coming?